Greetings and welcome to another episode of Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. I am honored to welcome Dr. Gloria Mark, Chancellor's Professor of Informatics at the University of California, Irvine, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Mark investigates how digital media shape human behavior and experience. With a PhD in psychology from Columbia University, her research focuses on multitasking, interruptions, and the effect of digital devices on mood and productivity. She has authored over 200 publications, and in 2017, she was inducted into the SCM SIGCHI Academy, an honor recognizing leaders in human-computer interaction. Professor Mark's work has reached both academic and popular audiences with presentations at SXSW and the Aspen Ideas Festival and the coverage in outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, The Atlantic, and the BBC, among others. Her research continues to offer valuable insights into the evolving interplay between technology and everyday life. In this episode, Dr. Gloria Mark shares thought-provoking insights from her research and her book, AttentionSpan, a groundbreaking way to restore balance, happiness, and productivity, exploring how we can better manage attention in the digital age. So, without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Gloria Mark to the podcast. Dr. Mark, I have been reading this book for a long time and have recommended it to many others in my network. It is a truly honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Mark, your research shows that the average person spends just 47 seconds on a screen before switching attention. How did you measure this? And why is this shift in attention so concerning for our mental health and productivity?
Yes. So I'm trained as a psychologist, and typically psychologists bring people into a laboratory and they set up controlled experiments so that you can control certain variables and focus on other variables of interest. But I always felt that if we really want to understand technology use, we have to go to where people are. We can't take them out of their environments. And so I always felt that I needed some method, some way to go to where people are. And so I used sensors. I used a variety of techniques and eventually began to use sensors so that I could track people as they go about their normal day-to-day activities. So we used logging techniques on people's screens, and that's how we discovered that people were switching their attention on average every 47 seconds, which astonished me at the time. And I will say that when we first started measuring this almost 20 years ago, we found that attention spans on screens averaged 2.5 minutes. In 2012, the average went down to 75 seconds. And then starting from around 2016 through just before the pandemic, the average attention spans were 47 seconds. And this has been replicated by other people as well. So I feel it's a pretty robust finding. Now, what impact does that have on us? Well, I imagine later on in the program, we're going to be talking about multitasking. It certainly causes stress. So stress is increased as we're switching our attention. And there are consequences on people's performance, which I imagine we'll get to again later in the show.
Professor, you introduced the concept of kinetic attention as a new way to understand focus in a digital world. How does kinetic attention differ from traditional idea of flow, and why is it more realistic for modern work?
Yeah, so when I discovered that people were shifting their attention so rapidly, I felt that I needed a new term to describe this. And I thought of physics and how the idea of describing something dynamic is you can use the term kinetic. And I thought kinetic attention is a very good description of what people do typically when they use their devices. So it's very different than flow because flow is about very deep engagement and immersion. When people are in flow, they're just not aware of the passage of time. And on the other hand, you can also not be aware of the passage of time if you're shifting your attention rapidly from screen to screen or from one screen to another device. But let's look at it a little bit differently. So if you can imagine attention as a flashlight. So with a flashlight, we can zoom out and we can have the light become very diffuse so that we can see a lot that's going on in the environment, but we may not see it very clearly. Or you can change that flashlight beam and you can focus it very narrowly. So you really are attentive to one thing, but then you're not aware of what else is going on in the environment. And so, what's really important when we think about attention is that we need to have control over that flashlight beam of attention in our mind to be able to zoom out when we need to, because sometimes we have to be aware of things going on in the environment, but we also need to be able to have control, the agency to be able to zoom in and focus that narrow beam when it's needed.
Dr. Mark, one of the myths you debunk is that we should always try to be focused. Can you explain how following our natural rhythms of attention can actually improve productivity and well-being?
Yeah, so if you look on the internet, you talk to people, everyone pushes this idea of focusing as long as possible. I once did an internet search and I found advertisements for learn to focus for 10 hours straight, focus nonstop. But that's just not natural for what humans can do. So people have limited cognitive resources, or you can think of this as limited attentional capacity. And when we use up that capacity by focusing, for example, or switching our attention fast, it drains those cognitive resources. We need those cognitive resources to be able to process information, to be able to make sense of our work, to be able to make sense of conversations. And so it's really important that these resources not drain too low because it harms our performance. Now, we've found in our research that people actually have natural rhythms of attention. So if you track people's attention over the day, you find that sometimes attention can be at a peak and then sometimes it can get into a valley. So it's very hard to pay attention. Typically, people have two peaks of attention, uh, sometime around mid-morning, sometime about mid-afternoon, but it's individual. There are individual differences. It depends on things like our biological rhythm. It depends on the tasks we're doing. And so it's really important to keep in mind that when we have these peaks, we should reserve that time for doing the work that's hardest to do, that requires the most effort, that requires the most creativity. And you don't want to spend that time doing email or being involved in a conversation that's really not going to bring much benefit. Take advantage of that time when you're at your attentional peak and use that to your advantage. So leverage it, and you'll be so much better off. And when your attention goes into a valley, right, when it's at a low point, that's the time to take a break and replenish and get your attention back up to speed.
Professor, many people view mindless activities like games or social media scrolling as purely wasteful. Your research suggests they can replenish mental resources. How can we use this activity strategically without falling into distraction?
Yeah, so it turns out from our research that people are happiest when they do these kinds of rote mindless activities like playing mindless games. Now, one thing to keep in mind, it's human to be distracted. So the problem is not getting distracted. The problem is when we can't pull ourselves out of a distraction. That's the problem. So if you've had a really hectic day or you just came out of a meeting where maybe there was conflict and you just want to clear your head, or you're about to go into another meeting that you know is going to be difficult, it's not bad to spend a few minutes, and I'm really stressing a few minutes, to do something like a mindless game, something that can calm your mind. And when you have that meeting in a few minutes, that becomes a hook to pull you out of this game. If you don't have a hook and you don't have control to be able to get out of this mindless activity, set a timer, right? And time yourself so that you know you can get out. So again, um, a mindless activity in itself is not bad. What is bad if we spend time doing it when we've got more important things to do? And I just want to mention, I want to bring up a story of the great American writer Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou wrote the book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. She wrote beautiful poetry. And she talked about having two states of mind. She had her big mind, which she used for doing her deep work. So that's what she really used when she was writing her books, her poetry. But then she also had what she called little mind. And her little mind was what she used to kind of pull back and take a break. And her little mind were activities like crossword puzzles, right? Things that really didn't involve deep thinking. And so she used little mind as a chance to kind of pull back, take a break, get her mind kind of, cleared up for a while and then going back. Now, social media scrolling, that's a different topic. And I'm not a fan of social media. I hardly use social media myself. And really be very careful about using social media, especially because of the content in it. And I certainly would not recommend using social media during a work day because it can just be too distracting. You read something awful, and the content stays with you in your mind, interferes with other things you're doing. So if you want to do something mindless, uh, do a simple game that, a simple word game or a visual game, just something that can help calm you down, and just do it for a few minutes.
Dr. Mark, you highlight multiple socio-technical forces that fragment our attention beyond just notifications. Can you elaborate on how media design, algorithms, and even personality types interact to affect our focus?
Sure. So let's start with algorithms. So algorithms have become increasingly sophisticated, and everything we do on the internet, we leave traces. And so algorithms can collect these traces. And based on what our interests are, what websites we go to, what we choose to like, or what we buy, algorithms can create profiles about us. And then uh, tech companies and ad remarketing companies can use these profiles to target information to us, information that these companies believe we would be interested in. And of course, if you're presented with information that's something you're interested in, it's going to capture your attention, and it's going to keep your focus on it. So companies have been very clever in their use of algorithms, and also especially a lot of algorithms are used to present content to us that uses techniques. Uh, for example, if I go to a website, and I write about this in the book, where I clicked on an advertisement, or I was at a shopping site and clicked on a pair of boots to look more closely. I left the site, and then everywhere I went on the internet, those boots were following me around on the internet. Sometimes the image was pulsing, it was daring me to click on it. And so that's an example of a technique that it's relentless because it just wants you to click and buy those boots so that, gets it out of your mind. So also algorithms can target the most basic emotions that we have. So emotions like fear or surprise or happiness even. And we respond to images or verbiage that can elicit these types of emotions for us. And so that's a way of how our attention is being manipulated. Let's move on and talk about personality. So it does turn out that people with different personality types uh, do have different ways of paying attention. So there's a personality test that's very standard. It's called the Big Five. You might have heard of it, and it has personality dimensions of openness to new experience, conscientiousness, extroversion or introversion, agreeableness, how well you get along with others, and neuroticism. And neuroticism, it turns out, plays a really important role. People who score high in neuroticism have much shorter attention spans. Why? Because neuroticism is about replaying events over and over in your mind. So let's say you had a dialogue with a colleague and you don't feel it went very well, you'll keep replaying that event over and over in your mind. And that interferes with your focus on the task at hand. And that's very, very typical of neurotics. Conscientiousness can also affect attention. Turns out people who score high in conscientiousness uh, check their email more often because they want to make sure that nothing slips by. And so they spend more time checking email, and as a result, they get distracted more. Okay, so you asked about media design. So let's talk about how we are part of a broader media environment. So yes, we have our digital tools, our computers, our smartphones, our tablets, but we also watch entertainment. And it turns out that shot lengths in films and television have been getting shorter and shorter over the years. And so if you were to look at your TV screen and turn the volume to off, so you're just looking at the visual images, you're going to watch them changing very rapidly. And that affects our attention because we become habituated to seeing things changing fast. Blockbuster films average about 2.5 seconds per shot. So if you're watching some, you know, blockbuster film like one of the Marvel comics films, you're going to see shots changing very, very fast. And every time people see some shot and then suddenly they have to switch to something else, we have to keep reorienting our attention to a new vantage point. and that can be draining. And let me just mention another way that media affects our attention is through the content lengths that are imposed on us by many kinds of sites, especially social media. We have to shorten the text and the videos that we post. And so we have become accustomed not only to posting things, but consuming things in terms of short snippets as opposed to long form texts.
The book describes 4 types of attention we experience daily. Could you briefly explain one or two types and share how recognizing them can help someone regain control over their focus?
Yeah. So in studying attention, I realized that there are really two dimensions of attention that are important. It's how engaged we are with something, of course, but it's also how challenged we are with something. Because if I'm, let's say, doing an analysis, a statistical analysis, that requires a lot of hard thinking. But if I'm playing a mindless game, I can be very engaged in it, but there's no challenge at all. And so I discovered that there are 4 kinds of attention that correspond to these two dimensions. So if you are engaged and challenged with something, I label this attention focus. It's a kind of attention. If you're really engaged and not at all challenged, like you're playing solitaire, I call this rote attention. If you're not engaged and not challenged with something, I call that boredom. And if you're really challenged to do something, but you're not engaged, for me, an example is when I have a tech problem. I'm very challenged by it, and I just can't get myself to be engaged. We call that frustration. So what can we do given that we have these different types of attention that we've labeled? Well, it's really important to be able to vary between focused attention and rote attention or boredom, because rote attention and boredom can give our minds a rest, doing things that are easy, right? And when you're doing rote attention, we found people are happiest when they're doing rote attention. And so it's important to vary our attention, to use variation so that we're just not focused continually.
Dr. Mark, multitasking is often seen as a necessary skill in modern work. Yet, your research shows it can hurt productivity. What practical strategies can people use to reduce multitasking without falling behind?
Yeah, so first of all, multitasking harms performance. So a lot of people think that, it's a badge of honor to be able to multitask. People think they can do more by multitasking. Multitasking does not mean doing two things in parallel at the same time because humans can't do that. Uh, we can do two things in parallel if one of those things is automatic. So you can walk and text at the same time because walking is automatic. But as soon as a bicyclist comes by or a car uh, puts you in danger, you have to pay attention and then you stop texting. So we can't do two things that require attention at the same time. Now, what multitasking means, it's about shifting attention. So we're shifting our attention very rapidly. Earlier, I talked about every 47 seconds on average. But here's why that harms performance. First of all, people make more errors. And we know this from decades of laboratory studies that when people are shifting their attention fast, they simply make more errors. There was actually a study done a few years ago which found physicians made a lot of errors in prescribing when they were multitasking, when they were shifting attention, which is really concerning. Second reason it's bad, it takes longer to do a task. So when you're, working on a task and then you suddenly shift attention, uh, it's almost like imagine having a whiteboard in your mind. And every time you do a task, you have to bring up the information you need for that task and you write it on that whiteboard in your mind. And then you suddenly switch your attention. You have to erase that whiteboard and you have to write new information for that next task. And so, what we're doing when we're switching our attention so fast is we're writing and rewriting on that internal whiteboard. And sometimes, just like in a real whiteboard, we can't erase it completely. Sometimes that happens in our mind. And the thing we just worked on leaves traces and interferes with the next thing we want to do. So, let's say your manager asked you to do a task and you start worrying about that, and then suddenly you switch to do something else. You're still thinking about what your manager asked you, and it's interfering with your current task at hand. And then multitasking leads to higher stress. So, what can we do? Well, make monotasking your new norm. Monotasking is working on one task to completion before you switch to do something else. So, a lot of things we do are automatic. So, we might automatically switch tasks without thinking. And so, I like to practice what I call meta awareness. And meta awareness means being aware of what you're doing as it's unfolding. That's the opposite of doing something automatically. So if we automatically switch to email, if you practice meta awareness, right, you're going to ask yourself, do I need to switch to email right now? It's about recognizing your automatic actions. It's about probing yourself to make sure that you understand why you're doing it and is it necessary to do that? And that's enough to help you do monotasking to stay on track. We can also consider that attention is goal directed. So we pay attention according to what our goals are. So that means it's really important to keep our goals in sight. We've done research and we find that when people identify their goals the night before, and then we ask them to reaffirm their goals the next day, people actually perform better. They stay on task more. But here's the problem. The problem is that it's very easy for goals to slip. And so people have to always remind themselves of goals. And it could be something as simple and low tech as writing it on a piece of paper next to you, putting it on that whiteboard in your office. But one more thing about goals is that it's really important to list emotional goals as well as task goals. How do you want to feel at the end of the day? What is your goal for how you want to feel? I like to feel rewarded or I want to feel fulfilled. And having that goal for how you want to feel can actually help get you closer to that feeling at the end of the day. And let me give one last piece of advice is that it's really important to take breaks. So if we're working ourselves through to exhaustion, remember we have limited cognitive resources, limited attentional capacity, and it's very precious. It's really important to take breaks to be able to replenish those cognitive resources. There's a part of our minds that's called executive function. And executive function can get exhausted. And executive function is like the CEO of your mind. It helps you stay on task. It helps you filter out distractions. It helps you keep to your goals. And so when it's fatigued, it just can't do its job. It can't filter out distractions. It can't help you stick to goals. And so that's why it's so important to take breaks throughout the day. And especially one really long, solid break is just essential to help our performance.
In the digital age, many people feel guilty for their perceived inability to focus. How can your research help people reframe these feelings and develop a healthier relationship with attention and technology?
Yeah, so remember again that we can't focus nonstop. It's not healthy for our minds. It drains our cognitive resources. We need to have substantial breaks. So the way I think about reframing uh, our work patterns is that the primary focus should be on our well-being, right? When we start our workday with a full tank of cognitive resources, and I love to use that metaphor of having a full tank, right? A full tank of energy, we can perform so much better. And when we have positive well-being, it also helps us perform. There's a theory in psychology that's called the broaden and build theory. And what this says is that when people feel positive, they can do more, they can be more creative, they can work better. And so when I think of managers and organizational decision makers, I think they need to focus on what they can do to promote employees' well being. Because if you put well being first, productivity will follow.
Dr. Mark, your research involved living laboratories, studying people in real world settings. Were there any surprising behavior or patterns that contradicted common assumptions about technology and attention?
Yeah, so first of all, when I spoke about earlier that to study people, I felt I needed to go where people are. Because if you bring people into a laboratory like most psychologists do, there's just no way you can recreate the things that people experience in their everyday lives, right? Conflicts that occur in the office or work trajectories that, someone might be going after a promotion or a competition or a cooperation or what makes people laugh. Not social relationships that cannot be reproduced in a laboratory. So in living laboratories, it gives us a better idea of how people are working with technology in their everyday lives. And so there were a few things that really surprised me. One of those is that there's a common assumption that researchers who work in this area have that when people experience interruptions, the interruptions come from outside of them. So, you might get an interruption from a phone call or a text chime or an email notification where a person comes into your cubicle. It turns out that when we observe people in the wild, which is what it's called, um, people tend to interrupt themselves. And what does that mean? So if I'm observing someone, what it means is that a person might be working. Let's say they're creating a document, and for no explainable reason, they suddenly stop what they're doing and they turn and make a phone call, or they turn to their email, or maybe they turn to social media. So there's something that caused people to interrupt themselves. It could be that people were reminded of something. Maybe the task they were working on reminded them of something they needed to do. Sometimes it's just random thoughts that come into our minds that lead us to switch our attention. And so, what was surprising is that people are almost as likely to interrupt themselves as they are to be interrupted by something outside of them. And what's interesting is when we looked at the data, we find that we looked at the data on an hourly basis and we looked at the amount of interruptions from outside of people. We call these external interruptions. And we compared this with interruptions that people do from themselves. And we find that when external interruptions drop in frequency, people begin to interrupt themselves even more. And the way I interpret this is that people are just habituated to keep interrupting, to being interrupted. And if the interruption is not coming from outside of themselves, they interrupt themselves to keep up that pattern of interruptions, which of course translates into shorter attention spans. Let me also talk about one other surprising thing, and that was something I mentioned earlier, the idea that people have rhythms of attention. So it's not like we, focus straight through in a day, but rather there are peaks and valleys of our attention throughout the day. And again, it corresponds to so many things. It corresponds to, did you start your day with a really good night's sleep? If so, you're starting your day with a full tank of cognitive resources. It depends on the tasks you're doing, how complex they are, what your emotional state is. But in general, we see that people's attention rises and falls throughout the day. And that was something surprising. It was not something I expected.
Dr. Mark, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Ultimately, attention span offers an optimistic vision of achieving balance in a hyper-connected world. For someone feeling constantly distracted and burned out, what first step would you recommend to start reclaiming their attention and well-being?
The first step is don't feel discouraged. So everyone, every single individual has the power to gain agency over their attention. And so one of the first steps that people can take is to focus on their well-being and keeping their attention replenished, right? Sleeping well, taking good breaks, keeping well-being when work life starts to become too stressed, being able to step back and take a break. And walking outside in nature is just a wonderful way to replenish. And it's also extremely important to psychologically detach from work at the end of the day. And that means when your formal work hours are done, there's no work communication. You don't stay on your email or texting to respond to work-related communications. Now, if that's a problem, if you're expected to do that, speak with your manager, speak with your team, get your organization to commit to allowing employees to psychologically detach. Now, countries are starting to enact laws. It's called the right to disconnect law. We see that in France, Ireland, Ontario, Canada, other countries as well. And I would love for this to be a movement because when people can psychologically detach, they can better psychologically reattach to work the next day. And what does that mean? That means being better motivated, better engaged, and having better performance. And that's the best way to be able to convince managers to allow you to psychologically detach. One of the smartest managers that I ever met was a very senior manager at the Boeing company. And I spent some time there as a visiting researcher. And he was so beloved by his staff. And the reason was that he cared about his employees' well-being. And so I was researching uh, different management and employee practices at the company. And so I would sit in on their meetings and I noticed how he remembered when one of his employees' child would be sick and he would inquire about it. He asked about another challenge that another employee experienced. He shared his own personal stories, and the staff was so um, uh, affected by this that they became really dedicated to him and were extremely hardworking. And he had very, very high ratings in the company, and the staff was just really motivated to do their best. So the bottom line is, and this is a message to managers and decision makers in companies, care about employees' well-being, because that's how you're going to get the best performance from them.
Listeners, we are deeply grateful to Dr. Gloria Mark for sharing her groundbreaking insights from AttentionSpan, a groundbreaking way to restore balance, happiness, and productivity. From the surprising realities about our fleeting attention spans to the myths that shape how we think about focus, Dr. Mark has given us a fresh framework to understand our relationship with technology and our own minds. Her research shows that while our attention may be challenged in today's digital world, it is far from lost. We can learn from harness it, follow our natural rhythms, and cultivate balance and well-being alongside productivity. Thank you, Dr. Mark, for offering not only a scientific lens, but also practical guidance for navigating the complexities of attention in the modern age. To our listeners, we hope you come away with a renewed sense of curiosity, self-compassion, and actionable ideas to reclaim your focus and mental energy. And do not forget to read Attention Span. Thank you so much, Dr. Mark, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.